In Beechwood Hollow, the Yates family name carried a kind of sacred sorrow. Their manor sat just above the lowland fields where mist clung to the grass like memory, and the iron gate had never once been seen unlocked. Locals whispered of their luck and their grief in the same breath, because while fortune favored the family in land and wealth, it stole from them every male child. 6 sons across 3 generations lowered into the family plot behind St. Elias Chapel, each with a ceremony that brought the whole town to tears. There were soft hymns, hands clasped in prayer, and the pale faces of grieving mothers draped in black lace. The coffins were always closed. No one questioned why. Beechwood Hollow had learned to treat silence like respect. It wasn't until the spring of 1978, when a heavy storm unearthed part of the cemetery's lower row, that the illusion began to rot. A groundskeeper new to the parish and unaware of the family's reverence arrived early to assess damage. The youngest grave, Joseph Yates, age 9, passed in 1963, had caved slightly, the earth around it sunken in. What the groundskeeper saw when he lifted the displaced stone lid was not bone, not decay, not even the remnants of burial cloth. The coffin held only river stones, smooth, wet-smelling, and tightly packed as if placed with care, not one trace of flesh or child. The discovery was not immediately reported. The groundskeeper told only the rector, who in turn summoned 2 elders from the Yates estate. Their arrival was quiet and unannounced. They brought no shovels, no tools, only a lantern and a box of matches. That evening the grave was resealed, but not before the groundskeeper noticed one of the men pulling something from the stones. A small object, glinting in the light. He was never able to describe it. He would later resign without a word and leave town. By summer, whispers curled through the hollow like mildew behind a church pew. Some said the boy had drowned, and the stones were meant to mimic the riverbed where his body was found. Others believed it was symbolic, a ritual of closure, the way some cultures bury tokens instead of bodies. But quiet doubts grew teeth when a former gravedigger, long retired and living in a home near the county line, was overheard muttering about the Hollow Boys. He claimed none of the Yates coffins ever made a sound when laid down. No weight, no resistance. He had asked once, only once, if there'd been a mistake with the casket. He said Theodore Yates looked him in the eye and said, "Not everything buried is dead." By autumn, one of the older cemetery maps surfaced in the local archive room. A faded layout with 6 Yates graves circled in red ink and annotated with strange, precise phrases. Sealed before body confirmed. To remain untouched. Memorial only. The last note beside the eldest son's plot read, "Placed without breath." Still no one dared dig. Not officially. Not until years later, when the case would tear open like a wound beneath the town's history. But for now, the empty grave became a bruise covered by tradition. A story rewritten by comfort. The Yates estate remained untouched, the chapel untouched. The family line mourned as a tragedy too sacred to examine. The mothers continued to leave lilies. The headstones continued to weather. But those who had seen inside that box, the stones arranged like ribs, the scent of wet clay instead of rot, would never forget what wasn't there. And beneath the surface, something had begun to shift. Something long buried but not resting. The old schoolhouse records were almost lost to mold. Buried beneath collapsed shelving in the cellar of the Beechwood Hollow Academy, they had sat untouched since the flood of 1943. It wasn't until a team of volunteers began cataloging artifacts for a historical display that the water-swollen register from 1891 was found, its spine flaking apart in the hands of a nervous archivist. The pages curled with time, but one name appeared again and again in the private annotation margins. Theodore Yates, not as headmaster nor instructor, simply noted with the term special hours. The records detailed a practice he called breath discipline, conducted off schedule and always with male pupils. The lessons were never announced. They did not appear on the official timetable. Boys were pulled from regular lessons with quiet nods, led to a detached structure behind the school, a converted greenhouse, since torn down. Theodore believed, according to the journal entries, that control over the breath was control over the will, that boys could be fortified not by knowledge, but by restriction. A strong son, he once wrote in the margins of a grammar workbook, is one who chooses stillness over panic. Surviving students, interviewed decades later by state historians, recalled the drills with fragmented clarity. They spoke of the underwater troughs, where faces were held beneath rain-collected water while Theodore counted slowly in Latin. The worst punishment was called quiet isolation, where boys were locked in a narrow wooden chamber with no windows and no known ventilation. The room earned a name among the children, the lung box. Inside there was no clock, only silence thick enough to bend the ears. Some fainted, some hallucinated. One boy, aged 12, emerged unable to speak above a whisper for the rest of his life. Theodore believed that fear was stored in breath, and that holding it deliberately with conviction could sever the instinct to cry, beg, or resist. He kept journals never published but cited in whispers, describing boys who learned to go still in the face of danger. One line read, "The body will flail, the soul must not." Parents never questioned the missing hours. The Yates name carried weight, and any child enrolled in Theodore's sessions was believed to be receiving advanced spiritual guidance. But rumors moved beneath the surface. One teacher claimed she found Theodore timing a child's breath with a pocket watch while the boy trembled in a water basin, his feet tied with rope to keep from fleeing. She resigned the next week. Her resignation letter simply read, "He calls it discipline. I call it rehearsal." Years later, after the original greenhouse was demolished, pieces of equipment were found embedded in the soil beneath. Rusted clamps, leather straps, and one iron mask with no mouth opening. The wood lining of the underground crawl space had been scorched, not by fire, but by something chemical. A residue remained that caused coughing in every worker who attempted to clear it. The site was eventually sealed. The surviving Yates mothers never commented. They claimed to know nothing of the special lessons. But private letters between Theodore and his eldest son, later recovered by a distant relative, suggested otherwise. In one, he described a successful session with the boy lasting 40 minutes with no breath disruption. Another read, "He cried at first, but silence took him, and that is progress." The term breath discipline never reappeared in any official curriculum, and no formal charges were ever filed. But for those who remembered, the memory of stillness became a kind of ghost. Boys who survived learned to control their panic too well. They stopped gasping when startled. They stopped wincing when struck. And those who didn't survive were never mentioned again, not in yearbooks, not in family Bibles, not in town ledgers. Just names erased by time, lungs emptied before their voices could carry. The Yates family called it training. The town never asked what for. For nearly 40 years, Emery Kell handled the dead of Beechwood Hollow with a reverence that bordered on obsession. He wore black gloves to every burial, whispered apologies to the unclaimed bodies, and never let a casket go into the ground unblessed. He believed the dead could feel weight. He believed they noticed who cared. But there was one family he never touched, not truly. One family whose dead arrived already boxed, already nailed, already wrong. The Yates. In the winter of 1946, Emery was 25 and still new to the trade when the Yates carriage rolled up to the funeral house just before dawn. The coffin was pale cedar, polished smooth but sealed with iron nails along every edge. There was no viewing request, no embalming order, no doctor's papers. Just a folded card left on the embalming table that read, "Handle nothing, proceed to burial." It was signed by Theodore Yates. At first, Emery assumed it was a family preference, a grief too sharp for formalities, but the moment he tried to lift the box, he froze. It was too light. Not empty, but not right. He'd carried infants in smaller coffins with more weight. His helper knocked gently on the lid, and the sound it made was hollow, not soft like flesh, not dense like bone. Something shifted inside like damp fabric sliding against wood. Over the years, the pattern repeated. Each time a Yates boy was declared dead, the family sent the casket already shut. No hospital ever issued a cause. No physician signed a death certificate. The dates were fixed, the burials fast, and Emery was never allowed to confirm the contents. When he once questioned the absence of a body for state forms, Theodore appeared that same evening. He placed a sealed envelope on the front desk and said, "The state respects tradition." Emery opened it after the man left. Inside was a donation check made out to the funeral home and a list of scripture verses about silence, obedience, and trust. But one burial would never leave him. In 1958, during an unusually wet spring, the fifth Yates son was declared deceased at age 11. The casket arrived soaked along its underside, the bottom edges dripping with a thick black residue. When Emery leaned in, he caught the unmistakable smell of river mud, rank, sour, and fresh. Not the slow rot of decay, but something recent, as if the coffin had been dragged through a marsh. He pried at one corner gently while no one watched, trying to lift just a sliver of the lid. But even the smallest motion made the box groan unnaturally, as though something inside had been packed too tightly. That night, he placed a thin towel beneath the casket's base to absorb the leaking fluid. In the morning, the towel was gone. He asked no more questions after that. But he kept a private ledger, names, dates, weights, and notes only he could read. He called it the Hollow Book. In it, beside each Yates son's entry, he wrote the same three-letter word, unwitnessed. It wasn't until his retirement in 1981 that Emery finally spoke of what he'd known. In a taped interview meant for private family history, he sat straight in his chair and said, "I never buried a Yates boy. I buried boxes, things that smelled like river water and old wood, but not death." When asked why he never reported it, he answered plainly, "Because someone higher than me wanted it that way, and because you don't open a coffin that doesn't want to be opened." The tape would be shelved for decades, but the words settled like soil on wet pine, heavy and unfinished. Emery died the following year, his own coffin filled with the weight of a truth never asked to be proven. And in Beechwood Hollow, the graveyard grass continued to grow over the sealed boxes of the Yates line, each one lighter than it should be, each one untouched by the hands meant to tend the dead. The Yates estate was a house of rules. No shoes past the second stair, no mirrors on the ground floor, no locked doors except those locked by Theodore himself. For the help, it was a place of discipline and silence, but the pay was good and the servants' quarters were warm in winter. So they followed the rules, even the strange ones. They never touched the red-lace tea tin. They never asked why the nursery had no windows, and they never opened the pantry door after sundown, because that door did not lead to food. It led to a room no one spoke of. A room without corners. Frances Darren was 17 when she first entered the Yates house as a maid. She was quick, respectful, and never curious in front of the family. But late one evening in 1932, while cleaning the kitchen alone, she noticed the pantry door slightly ajar. Inside, instead of shelves and flour sacks, she found a narrow corridor, one she had never seen before. It led to a second door, thick and whitewashed, with a latch worn smooth. Beyond it was the strangest room she had ever stepped into. It was shaped like a stop sign. 8 walls, no corners. The surfaces were painted bone white, smooth and chalky to the touch. There were no windows, no lamps, only a faint glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The floor was polished and unscuffed, though she would later swear it smelled faintly of bleach and ash. Along each wall, just above head height, ran a single narrow slit no wider than a finger. From these slots came sound, not loud, not constant, but an occasional whisper, as if someone just beyond the walls was breathing words too softly to understand. The whispers echoed even when the room was still. She stood in the center only once. The air shifted around her like the room inhaled. A deep cold ran up her spine. Then the latch clicked behind her and she ran. Later, when she dared ask the other maids about it, no one answered. One older cook muttered a single phrase before shaking her head. "It's not our job to know what breaks the boys." From that day, Frances kept her head down. But she watched, and she noticed. Each of the Yates sons, once old enough to stop crying at night, was taken behind that pantry door. Sometimes one at a time, sometimes together, always led by Theodore, who held a slim, leather-bound notebook as he walked. The boys never resisted. They walked like they were going to church. Sometimes they returned looking dazed. Sometimes they didn't return at all. Frances stayed 2 years before the house began to give her dreams. In one, she stood in the octagonal room again. But the walls pulsed like lungs and the whispering grew louder, forming words she couldn't forget. Breathe the shape. Become the shape. She left without notice the following morning and never returned. In her later years, long after Theodore had died and the estate had shuttered, she gave a brief statement to a regional historian compiling oral accounts of the Yates family. Her voice trembled when she spoke of the room. "It wasn't just that it had no corners, it's that you didn't either when you stood inside. You stopped having edges, like the room took them." The historian wrote down her words but left them out of the final archive. Too strange, he claimed, too unclear. But Frances never changed her story, and when demolition crews arrived decades later to survey the old Yates estate, they found no blueprint matching such a room. The pantry wall was solid brick, no corridor, no second door, no white chamber. But the youngest worker reported hearing whispers when he leaned against the wall. Soft, breathy, and cold, he never came back for the second day of work. The fire that spread through the east wing of the Yates estate in 1973 was small by most standards, contained within 2 rooms, extinguished before dawn, no fatalities, no official cause. Electrical fault, they claimed. But fire doesn't just scorch wood, it peels back what was sealed. And when the reconstruction crew began removing charred beams from the upstairs study, one worker noticed something strange. A hollow sound behind the oak paneling, like a cavity disguised as structure. Behind a false beam above the fireplace mantel, they found a narrow compartment stuffed with brittle paper. 37 folded letters, each bound with twine and labeled in smudged ink. C.J.Y. The letters were passed to the property's executor, then quietly shelved in a locked drawer for years. It wasn't until 1982, during a legal audit, that someone finally read them. They were written by Julian Yates, the firstborn son, the one the family claimed had drowned in 1901 at the age of 11. The one whose funeral was the first to be closed casket. But these letters were dated between 1902 and 1905, 3 years after his death. and they were written from inside the house. The handwriting began uneven, scrawled in a child's hand, but grew tighter, more clinical with each page. In them, Julian describes something he calls Method C, a purification trial instructed by his father, Theodore. The ritual began, he said, with silence. Not just verbal silence, but the removal of all noise from the body, covering the ears, muffling the mouth, blindfolding the eyes. He was kept in a chamber for long stretches of time without light, without food, without movement, save for the moments his father entered to administer what he called the white syrup. Julian described it as milky, tasteless, and thick. It was fed to him in small doses through a dropper while he was restrained. Within minutes, his limbs would turn cold. He would lose all sensation in his arms and feet. Soon after, his thoughts would slow and his body would float away while his breath stayed low and even. He said that when he tried to panic, the room itself would pulse as if it rejected fear. The syrup was meant to help the body let go of its primitive voice, according to Theodore. Julian called it the liquid that taught him to disappear. He wasn't alone in the chamber. He never saw others, but he heard breathing, slow, practiced, synchronized with his own. Sometimes it stopped altogether, and he was left in complete stillness. That, he wrote, was the true trial. To stay silent even when the silence became unbearable, to breathe without sound, to wait without memory. Each letter chronicled his progress, noting the durations of stillness achieved, the hallucinations experienced, and the praise phrases Theodore whispered during each visit. But the last letter shifted. No date, no sign-off, just a single page, edges curled and browned from where the fire nearly consumed it. In it, Julian wrote, "I felt my name detach. I tried to say it in the dark and couldn't recall how it began. Father says I am almost clean. But something in the syrup is wrong. I don't sleep anymore. I pause. And when I do, I dream of nothing, which is worse than dreaming of pain. If I don't write again, it means I've passed. He said that means I'm ready." The letter ends mid-sentence. The remaining pages were blank. There was no record of Julian after 1901, no school enrollment, no death certificate, just the staged funeral, the sealed casket, the mourning town. And now these letters, neatly preserved despite the fire, hidden behind a beam that had never been part of the original house blueprint. The room they described, the ritual they documented, and the substance they mentioned had no equivalent in medical or religious texts. Yet the handwriting was undeniably his. The letters were quietly handed to state officials. No charges were filed, no public statement released. They were sealed in a private archive marked unsubstantiated testimony, domestic ritual. But those who read them never forgot the boy's words, especially one line underlined 3 times in red. He says, "Real sons aren't born. They are erased." The attic of the Yates estate had remained sealed longer than any other part of the house. Generations of dust blanketed its boards like old snow, and the door had long since warped shut from heat and silence. When a team of renovation workers arrived in the summer of 1971 to restore the east gables, they expected dry rot and nesting animals, not history, not horror. The latch snapped clean when struck, and the air that spilled out was sharp, dry, and almost metallic. It was as if the space had been holding its breath. Among the usual clutter, broken furniture, boxes of rotting hymnals, a cracked oil painting of the family's patriarch, was a single object that didn't fit, a small iron chest no larger than a suitcase, hidden beneath a collapsed trunk and wedged between the rafters. It was thick, riveted at every corner and sealed with a padlock so rusted it crumbled at the touch. Inside, nestled in black velvet, were 6 soft velvet pouches, Each was tied with gold thread, each labeled with stitched linen tags bearing three-letter initials: JY, EY, RY, SY, LY, and HY, the known initials of all 6 deceased Yates sons. The first pouch, unwrapped carefully by the crew supervisor, revealed a full set of human teeth. Child-sized, clean, laid out in perfect dental order, each one set into the velvet as if arranged for display. The molars were still forming, the canines oddly blunt, a full mouth extracted with care, no blood, no bone. Just enamel, ivory pale and strangely polished. The second pouch was the same, so was the third. By the time the 6th pouch was opened, the men had stopped speaking. One man refused to touch the velvet. Another left the property without signing out. A call was placed to the county coroner, who arrived with gloves, a camera, and a look of practiced detachment that didn't last more than a few minutes. He photographed the contents, took one of the sets back for analysis, and said only this as he left: "Whoever pulled these did it without trauma. No jaw fragments were present, no signs of damage or cracking. Each tooth had been removed as if gently plucked from the mouth of a child who had not resisted." That detail disturbed the coroner more than anything else. There were no tool marks, no indication of struggle. It was as though the mouths had willingly given them up. Back at the lab, the dental development stages suggested the children were all between the ages of 9 and 12. Identical age ranges listed on the Yates boys' death records. But no DNA could be pulled from the enamel. Too old, too meticulously cleaned. The cloth tags were hand-stitched in the same style, same thread. One theory suggested the teeth were preserved as a form of mourning ritual, a Victorian holdover. But no documentation of such a practice involved full extractions, only baby teeth, never all 32. The velvet used in the wrapping was dated to a textile merchant in nearby Westridge known for manufacturing funeral linings. His ledgers showed several bulk orders placed under the name T. Yates, each specifying custom child burial cloth, non-bleeding. No follow-up orders, no questions asked. The iron box was stored in the state archive under the classification Private Memorial Artifact, its contents legally untouchable by non-family members. But the archivist who cataloged it made a private note in the system, one that never reached the public ledger. It read, "Too precise to be grief. Feels more like a collection." No explanation was ever offered by the remaining Yates descendants. When questioned, one surviving cousin simply said, "Teeth come loose eventually. Some fathers just collect what they lose." But no one could explain why they were all permanent teeth. No one could say why each mouth was accounted for in its entirety. And no one wanted to ask why, if the boys were truly buried as claimed, these were not entombed with them. In that attic, under rotting beams and faded portraits, the truth had waited in velvet, soft, organized and grinning. The ledger from Westridge State Sanatorium had been forgotten in a damp metal drawer, tucked beneath outdated morphine inventories and yellowing staff rosters. The asylum had shuttered its doors in 1956 after a scandal involving patient neglect, and most of its records were scattered or incinerated. But when an archivist conducting a historical audit opened that last rusted drawer, what she found was a single file labeled Elliot Y in red pencil, faded and smudged. No surname was recorded beyond the initial, no next of kin, but the date of admittance, March 4th, 1912, and the patient's reported age, 11, matched only one boy from Beechwood Hollow, a Yates son who had never been publicly listed as deceased, one who, according to the town's records, had simply stopped appearing after that winter. The intake sheet listed him as nonverbal, thin for his age, and exhibiting what the attending physician called a flat affect with a disturbing tolerance to physical restraint. His fingernails were clipped down to the quick. His breathing, though shallow, was slow and controlled, deliberate, unnaturally even. When nurses tried to feed him, he refused food but accepted water as long as it was delivered with a dropper. The file noted repeatedly that he showed no emotional reaction to pain stimuli. One line read, "Patient responds with stillness, not defense." For 6 weeks, Elliot Y. remained silent. Then one morning, when a nurse entered to change his bandages, he spoke. Just one phrase. He did not whisper. He did not stammer. He looked directly at her and said, "It was white, and it made us forget pain." After that, he never spoke again. The phrase was recorded in quotation marks, underlined twice in blue ink. The nurse, according to the report, was shaken but could not elaborate. When asked what it referred to, she could only describe a deep, unsettling feeling like hearing a memory you don't recall making. She resigned 2 days later. In later assessments, doctors noted that Elliot displayed signs of dissociative conditioning, a term rarely used at the time. He responded to metronome beats with involuntary blinks, as if waiting for commands that never came. He flinched at sudden changes in light but did not react to sharp noise. He had calloused skin along his wrists and neck but no active wounds. When shown photographs of children, he blinked slowly. When shown blank walls, he smiled faintly. The most disturbing entry came from a visiting psychiatrist who had worked with trauma victims during the war. After observing Elliot for a full hour, the doctor concluded, "This boy has been trained to leave his body without dying. Whatever was done to him, it was not meant to injure him. It was meant to erase him." Staff tried to contact family. The Yates estate never responded. A courier delivered a sealed envelope once containing a banknote and a typed message. "Keep him safe. He is not to be returned." No signature, no address. In 1915, 3 years after his admittance, Elliot Y. vanished from the sanatorium. No official discharge, no record of transfer. One morning, his bed was empty, the door still locked from the outside. The only thing left behind was his hospital-issued nightshirt, neatly folded beneath the cot. On top of it, drawn in smudged charcoal, was a single image, an octagonal shape, with 8 sides and no corners. The sanatorium listed his case as a clerical disappearance and was shut down the following year. The file remained buried until its accidental discovery decades later. Today, Elliot Y.'s name appears nowhere in official genealogies. No burial plot, no obituary. Just a missing boy whose voice was taken, then used once to tell a truth no one knew how to hear. And in the silence of that file drawer, long sealed and water-stained, one thing became clear. Not every Yates son was buried. Some were just removed. Some survived longer than they were meant to. And for at least one of them, survival wasn't a mercy. It was the beginning of something worse. The storage shed was never meant to be found. Tucked behind a crumbling stone wall at the far edge of the Yates estate, it was disguised beneath layers of ivy and thyme. It had no hinges, no signage, and no obvious entrance. Only a warped wooden panel that gave way when struck at the right angle. Inside, the air was dry, preserved like something embalmed, and the temperature noticeably colder than outside. Dust clung to everything, but the interior had not rotted. There were no shelves, no windows. Just a single rusted table with 5 magnetic tape reels stacked neatly in the center. Their labels long faded except for one word scratched into the metal casing. "Listens." Each reel was wrapped in cloth and sealed with wax, the edges brittle with age. Tucked between the first and second spool was a folded note written on yellowed ledger paper. The handwriting, uneven and clipped, read only this: "Exposure must not exceed 44 minutes. Repetition beyond cycle 3 may induce loss of self-recognition. Do not listen alone." The first reel began with static, then a pattern, soft metallic clinks evenly spaced like a chain tapped gently against ceramic tile. 4 beats pause, 4 beats pause. Beneath it, an almost imperceptible hum began to rise, low and steady, vibrating just below conscious notice. The sound grew louder in waves, not through volume but through presence, as if the noise wasn't playing from the tape but through the listener. Each cycle introduced a new element, clicking, then a burst of static like air being sucked into a vacuum, then a sustained, hollow tone that pressed against the skull. By the 5th cycle, listeners reported dizziness. By the 7th, the room felt as though it were shrinking. The tone wasn't melodic. It wasn't music, but it stuck in the body like a memory. One listener, a sound technician brought in to digitize the recordings, claimed he felt his fingers move in patterns he couldn't explain. Another said they wept during playback but didn't know why. Most stopped listening before reaching cycle 3, but one didn't. An assistant archivist, eager to impress and alone during his shift, played the reel past the 44-minute mark. What began as mild disorientation quickly shifted to something deeper. He was found later that evening sitting motionless in the hallway outside the archive room, unblinking, his own name written in pen down both of his arms again and again as if trying to remember who he was. He couldn't describe the sound. He said only that it made him feel empty in the middle. Further analysis revealed the tapes had been recorded on modified equipment not standard for the time. There were inconsistencies in the waveform, unnatural dips in frequency and fluctuations that mimicked patterns found in hypnotic entrainment, audio stimulation designed to alter consciousness. One scientist speculated that the tones were constructed not to be heard, but to train. Like a metronome for something internal, something behavioral. No source documents explained the purpose of the tapes. But one photograph found in the same shed showed a group of boys seated in a windowless room, each with wires clipped to their temples, eyes closed, mouths covered with cloth. In the corner, a reel-to-reel machine ran soundlessly. The photo was dated 1909. In the bottom right corner, barely visible, were the initials TY. The tapes are now sealed in the state's restricted archive under the heading Auditory Conditioning Experiments, unclassified. Playback is prohibited, but the copies exist. And somewhere the tone still lives on the magnetic ribbon, waiting for someone to press play, waiting for another cycle. The basement beneath the Yates estate was never mapped. Unlike the upper floors, whose layout was etched into public records for the sake of property valuation, the lower chambers were undocumented. The stairs leading down were hidden behind a paneled wall in the library, sealed with a latch rusted shut from the inside. When contractors finally pried it open in 1983 during a structural survey meant to determine if the house could be restored or demolished, they found more than rot and mildew. They found the quiet hum of something preserved. The room at the base of the stairs was stone-lined, circular, and colder than any part of the house above. In its center, on a pedestal bolted into the concrete floor, sat an old lantern. Not oil, not electric. Something in between. Its glass casing was frosted from within, its metal frame blackened but unbroken. At first glance it appeared decorative, almost ceremonial. But when one worker wiped the glass with his sleeve, he recoiled. Inside the lantern, suspended in a thick, glowing substance the color of pale amber, was a human spinal cord, coiled tightly, curled like a filament, each vertebrae intact and clean. No blood. No decay. The substance encasing it was viscous, almost gel-like, but emitted a faint pulsing light as if reacting to air or movement. The glow intensified when the lantern was disturbed, dimmed when left untouched. No heat came from it. The liquid didn't bubble or settle, it simply held. When forensic experts were brought in days later, they confirmed what no one wanted to say aloud. The spinal cord was human, belonging most likely to a child between the ages of 10 and 12. It had not fossilized. It had not been chemically treated. And yet there were no signs of decomposition, no cellular breakdown, no bacterial presence. It was preserved with a method no one could replicate or reverse engineer. Tests on the fluid yielded nothing recognizable. No formaldehyde, no silicone, no stabilizing agents. It resisted classification entirely. A label was etched faintly into the lantern's base, almost missed beneath the corrosion. C3 L Exid, proven ready. The notation, anatomical in structure, matched cervical and lumbar vertebrae markers. But the phrase beneath suggested intent, proven ready, for what no one could answer. Investigators searched for any documentation, medical logs, anatomical studies, ritual manuals. None were found. But the structure of the room told its own story. Small brackets lined the walls as if meant to hold instruments or restraints. One wall held faint scratch marks in vertical groupings like someone had once tallied days or tests. Above the pedestal, a metal ring hung from the ceiling, suspended by a thin wire. Directly beneath it, the floor was stained, not with blood, but something else. A ring-shaped pattern, discolored and slightly raised, as if the stone had reacted to heat or pressure over time. No records ever listed a child missing from the Yates household. No surgeries were filed, no permits. And no burial ever noted the removal of a spine. But the initials CY and the third Yates son, Charles, matched the approximate age and timeline. His obituary was brief, the cause of death listed simply as sudden illness. His coffin, like all the others, had been sealed before public viewing. The lantern was moved to a private lab under federal supervision. Its glow persisted. Over time, researchers noted something stranger. The spine seemed to shift slightly every few days, rotating gently like a clock hand moving between invisible hours. No mechanism was found, no magnetic force, no vibration, just movement. As if whatever was inside still remembered rhythm, still obeyed it. The object is now sealed in a climate-controlled vault, deemed both biological specimen and unexplained artifact. But those who examined it, truly examined it, reported dreams in the weeks after, of breathing through bone, of light behind the eyes, of a voice that whispered through the vertebrae, not in words but in patterns. One phrase appeared repeatedly in a technician's notes before she resigned without explanation. "It's not a lantern. It's a body waiting to finish." And in the space it once stood, the basement grew darker, the air heavier, as if something had been removed that was never meant to leave. The file sat untouched for over 70 years, buried in the recesses of a long-defunct patent office annex in upstate New York. It had never been digitized, never requested, never referenced in legal or medical journals. But when a local historian submitted a wide-ranging FOIA request in 1991 looking for 20th-century designs linked to unauthorized behavioral experiments, the system flagged a single entry. Patent submission number 241B-04 et al. Applicant Theodore M. Yates. Filed August 12, 1904. Status lapsed, unapproved. Its title was short but jarring. Oxygen deprivation chambers for use in pre-adolescent spiritual conditioning. The file included 4 engineering sketches, each labeled Prototype AD, and 6 typed pages of justification authored by Yates himself. He described the invention as a chamber for the temporary withholding of environmental stimuli and breath access, designed to cleanse pre-moral instincts in the male child. The language was cold, clinical, but dressed in theological phrasing. The term he returned to repeatedly was spiritual anesthesia, a state in which a child would neither think, panic, nor remember, only submit. Each chamber was coffin-sized but upright, like a standing wardrobe. The internal walls were padded with soft plaster to reduce noise feedback. A filtration valve regulated trace oxygen release, enough to sustain unconsciousness without full asphyxiation. One design included a circular breathing mask with a slow leak valve, deliberately faulty. Another featured an hourglass-shaped canister mounted near the headrest, which Yates described as the will reservoir, though no function was assigned to it. The proposal justified use on boys under age 12, citing that moral frameworks are not yet hardened, and the ego is malleable when breath is controlled. Nowhere in the submission was parental consent mentioned. The stated goal: to induce a state of passivity that mimics pre-birth conditions, allowing fear and rebellion to be bypassed entirely in future conduct. In one handwritten addendum, Yates noted the following: when breath becomes gift, not assumption, the boy understands silence as kindness. Pain never had to be part of it. The body will forget, the mind must not. No one followed up. The patent office marked it inadmissible, no verifiable scientific framework, and filed it without inquiry. But there was no requirement to report the submission to law enforcement. And Yates had not needed approval to build the prototypes. The designs alone were his permission. Years later, a sealed court transcript surfaced during a wrongful death investigation tied to another local institution. Among the exhibits was testimony from a blacksmith named Eli Rohn, who had been contracted by a wealthy Hollow client in 1905 to construct iron fixtures for what was described as sensory stillness units. Rohn recalled forging custom hinges that locked from the outside, hollow breathing tubes shaped like reeds, and tempered glass portholes small enough to barely view a child's face. He never saw the chambers installed. He was paid in gold coins and told never to speak of the order. He didn't, not until his deathbed. The transcript was sealed under protective order. The defendant, unrelated to Yates, was acquitted. But the judge's private notes revealed deep concern. He had written, "If these devices existed, they were built for more than silence. They were built for rehearsal." To this day, no physical chamber has been recovered. But in the blueprints detailed down to every bolt, the intention was clear. These were not isolation booths. They were sculpting tools. Not for the body, but for the instinct inside it. Tools meant to interrupt the basic assumption that breath is ours, that it comes freely. Theodore Yates believed in earned oxygen, in submission through stillness. And somewhere beneath his estate, or perhaps within its walls, now gone to rot, he had built the lessons into steel and silence. The breath trials were not punishment. They were preparation. The sons were not failed. They were measured, and most failed quietly. The women who married into the Yates line were not naive. They came from respectable families, well-read, well-bred, observant. But the house changed them, slowly, without bruises, without screams. The rules weren't shouted, they were etched into silence. Most arrived wide-eyed and eager to please, only to learn within weeks that certain things were not spoken aloud. Not even in prayer. By the second month, each woman was taught the expectations of Reflection Week. It came without warning, sometimes twice a year, sometimes more. It lasted 7 days, always beginning on a Sunday at dusk, always ending with a pale dawn where nothing was discussed. During those weeks, the Yates boys disappeared from the breakfast table, from lessons, from the grounds. No questions were permitted. Mothers were told it was a spiritual right, that it was their duty to remain still, quiet, reverent. No meals were to be brought upstairs. No footsteps heard past the second floor, no music, no mirrors. Some were told their sons were meditating. Others were told they were fasting. One woman was handed a single phrase on a folded card by Theodore himself. "You gave them form. Now we must give them shape." The diaries left behind by these women, hidden in false book covers, behind wallpaper seams, under drawer linings, reveal the quiet unraveling. One mother wrote, "His eyes were different when he came back. Not empty, not broken, just trained. Like a voice had been removed that I never knew was there." Another described hearing a low, rhythmic thudding coming from the floor above her room every night of the week. She counted the beats. They never sped up. They never stopped. But one entry stands apart from the rest. It belonged to Margaret Hale Yates, the wife of Theodore's second son. Her journal, recovered in 1989 behind a warped piano panel in the Manor's abandoned music room, is mostly mundane. Recipes, hymns, idle worries. But there is one section dated October 3, 1937, written in a trembling hand across multiple pages. It begins with a smell. She wrote that on the third night of Reflection Week, she stepped outside to clear her head and caught the scent of bleach on the wind, sharp and bitter, out of place in the cool, earthy air of the forest surrounding the estate. The smell grew stronger as she neared the tree line. She followed it, half asleep, half sick with guilt. She didn't bring a lamp. She didn't call her son's name. She walked quietly, barefoot. She wrote, "I don't know what I expected. Maybe I hoped to find him kneeling, praying, but I found something else." The following pages were torn. But pressed between the remaining sheets was a dried scrap of cloth, coarse and white, singed at one edge. Margaret's final paragraph says only, "I returned alone. I was given tea and a fresh set of linens. He came back the next morning, lips chapped, silent, eyes wide. I said nothing. It was never asked of me again." Margaret never wrote another journal entry. Her name appears on no protest or complaint. She died in 1946 of what doctors labeled sudden heart cessation at age 38. Her son, Edward Yates, would be listed as deceased less than 2 years later. Closed casket, no viewing. None of the Yates mothers ever spoke publicly. But in the silences they maintained, in the words they carefully avoided, pain, breath, choice, a pattern becomes visible. They were not absent. They were present. They were witnesses who'd been taught how to vanish without leaving. And in the rituals they were forbidden to question, their sons were reshaped into something obedient. Something that came back clean, eyes wide, and voice stolen. The question they never asked was not where their sons went. It was why they came back quieter than they left. And in that not asking, the legacy was preserved, not by cruelty, but by compliance. It took over a century for the state to issue the order. Years of closed whispers, buried affidavits, and sealed archives finally buckled under the weight of too much missing, too much unspoken. In 1994, a circuit judge with no ties to Beechwood Hollow authorized limited exhumation of the Yates family plot. Not all 6 graves, just 3. Enough to confirm or deny the rumors that had stalked the town like shadow. That the sons were never in their boxes, that mourning had been staged, that the soil held no bones. The ruling was meant to bring closure. It did anything but. The first coffin belonged to Elias Yates, listed as deceased in 1910 at the age of 10. His grave had long since lost its headstone to ivy and erosion. When workers lifted the lid, what they found was nothing. Not decay, not residue, just space. The interior was pristine, lined in dark cloth with no visible stain or indentation, untouched by death or time. It might never have held a body at all. The second casket was worse. This one had belonged to Stephen Yates, who had passed peacefully in 1927 during a church retreat, according to the obituary. The lid came off slower this time, the air inside sharp with a sour chemical tang, something artificial preserved. Instead of a child's remains, The coffin held a length of weighted fabric sewn to resemble the shape of a body, stuffed with ash-soaked wool and stitched with black thread along the chest. At the center of the fabric torso was a small wooden disc carved on both sides. One side held a symbol, 8 equal lines radiating out like a wheel. The other side was blank, scorched around the edges. An artifact, a placeholder, a stand-in for a boy no longer there. The third casket was marked for Harold Yates. He was the last of the line, lost in 1949 at the age of 12. His funeral had been the most elaborate. The choir sang 2 hymns. The town was invited. His mother wept through a veil so thick her face was never seen. When the coffin was raised, the wood groaned as if remembering something it hadn't meant to keep. Inside was a mask. It was human-sized, carved from lightwood and shaped like a child's face, but hollowed from behind, thin as a whisper and split down the center like it had once been worn and pried off. The eyes were gouged smooth, featureless. The mouth had no opening, only a shallow depression stitched shut with twine embedded into the wood itself. Around the edges were small notches, 12 in total, evenly spaced. On the inside surface, where a face might press against it, was a line of writing burned in tight script. Speech is the last rebellion. There were no bones, no teeth, no hair, just the mask, set like a relic at the heart of the casket, a token of something removed. Afterward, the findings were reviewed by coroners and forensic anthropologists. They could not confirm death. They could not confirm burial. The official language used in the final report was ceremonial misrepresentation of remains. But to those who had waited decades for truth, the message was clear. The coffins had always been props. Still, reburial was mandatory. The caskets were reclosed and lowered again under state supervision. This time, no prayers were offered. No one from the Yates family appeared. But one former groundskeeper, now well into his 70s, stood at the edge of the plot and muttered a single line as the last coffin disappeared beneath the soil. They only buried what was left over. A week later, the same judge who authorized the exhumation ordered the site sealed for 50 years. Public access denied. Media coverage suppressed. The town returned to quiet. But nothing truly settled. In the months following the event, 3 archivists resigned from the state records office, citing recurring dreams. One claimed she kept seeing boys with mouths sealed by thread, walking single file into water. Another spoke of the sound of breath stopping mid-inhale, as if someone else had taken over the body halfway through the motion. The coffins were reburied, the files reclassified, but what they had revealed could not be buried again. Not fully. Not now. Because the question had changed. It was no longer why the boys were buried without bodies. It was what became of the bodies before the graves were ever dug. In the spring of 1996, the name Yates finally left the confines of Beechwood Hollow. It appeared on national television, printed across headlines, dissected in late-night programs and policy briefings. What had once lived only in whispers, the oddity of sealed coffins, the strange disappearance of 6 sons, the unrecoverable traces of breath rituals and anatomical relics, was now public record. Mostly, the media called it a Gothic tragedy. Congress called it a loophole. Historians called it a failure to question power when it wore the right clothes and spoke softly enough to avoid suspicion. But beneath the noise, the facts remained strangely weightless. The coffins were empty. The tapes were real. The lantern still glowed. Yet no living member of the Yates family was charged. No criminal case was filed. Too much time had passed. Too little flesh remained. And so, a different kind of action was taken. That year, under mounting pressure from lawmakers, clergy groups, and the families of children lost to similar private faith programs, The United States Congress passed the Yates Act. The legislation was brief but clear. Any private burial, whether religious or secular, would now require photographic documentation of remains, independent third-party certification of death, and access to inspection upon request by state authorities. The law was not retroactive. The past would remain untouched, but the future, they promised, would be verified. It was one of the few times in modern history that a single family's name became shorthand for a form of institutional erasure. The Yates Act passed with quiet bipartisan support. No one argued against the dead boys. No one stood to defend a lineage of sealed boxes and chemical breath chambers. But no one could quite explain how it had happened either. How the town, the church, the mothers, the doctors had all gone still at the same time, for so long. A monument was constructed later that year at the edge of Beechwood Hollow, not far from the family cemetery. Simple stone, no names, just 6 child-sized statues facing inward in a circle, their mouths closed, hands at their sides. At the center stood a plaque that read, "For those who were taken before they could speak." Beneath it, in smaller print, the Yates Memorial, 1901-1949. No one from the surviving Yates line attended the unveiling. The estate had long since been sold off in parcels, stripped of anything useful, haunted more by silence than legend. A cousin in Michigan denied any connection. A great-niece in Oregon declined comment. By the time the news crews packed up, the town was already erasing the footage from memory. The monument remains, but no one visits. Weeds curl around the base. Rain has softened the features of the children's faces. Their eyes are nearly gone. Inside the state archive, 3 file drawers remain sealed under redacted status. The documents are labeled with codes instead of names. CYC04, Method C. Filament Subject 1. A select group of analysts, given brief and temporary clearance, reported disturbing trends across the sealed documents. Notations of pattern conditioning, references to ritualized breath denial as a tool of obedience, and a recurring phrase scrawled in the margins of multiple entries. We do not bury the failed. We reuse them. The identity of the author is unknown. In the months after the Yates Act passed, several anonymous letters were delivered to the State Ethics Board. None were signed. Most were fragments, phrases, memories, brief confessions that could never be verified. But one stood out. Written in shaky, ink-faded cursive, it arrived folded into a blank envelope with no return address. It contained only one line. Evil doesn't hide in shadows. It hides in tradition. The letter now rests in a glass case beside the lantern recovered from the Yates basement, though its glow has since dimmed. Tour groups are not allowed. No press photography is permitted. The exhibit is open only to scholars with pre-approved credentials. Most walk out shaken. A few request that their names not be associated with the research. One archivist resigned after hearing her daughter hum a melody she swore matched one of the tone sequences recovered from the tapes, despite the child never having been exposed to them. The legacy, it seems, is not just buried, it lingers. Not in ghosts or curses, but in the structures that once made it possible. The unchecked names, the unquestioned funerals, the silence around what sons are made to endure when fathers call it discipline, and mothers are told to pray harder instead of speak louder. The Yates story didn't end with fire or trial. It ended in policy, in paperwork, in law passed too late. But even now it warns, it whispers. That real evil doesn't announce itself. It aligns itself with old hymns and polished shoes, with quiet parlors and words like reflection, that it doesn't need to break the rules when it's allowed to write them. And maybe that's the hardest part to look at, that no one stopped it. Not because they couldn't, but because they thought it was normal. What do you think? Could something like this still happen? Would we even notice? Or would we still look away the way they all did because the coffins looked heavy and the names sounded holy?